Hey everyone, my name is Nishat Akhtar. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a creative director at Instrument. I'm an illustrator, designer. I am a first generation American from a mixed heritage. There's so many different aspects of my life that we can maybe talk about, as we will also talk about with Tahirah. Our conversation today is titled Insecurity through an intersectional lens. And the first thing that I want to say and call into this conversation in this room is just defining intersectionality. I think that that is a topic and or a term that is like very popularized and people understand, you know, a crosswalk and how those two things intersect. But actually this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She is a Black activist, lawyer, writer, and she wrote this paper in 1989, coining this term, intersectionality, and the paper itself was called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. It's a Black feminist critique on anti-discrimination. So when we talk about intersectionality at the core, we are talking about the intersection of racism and sexism with the foundation of Black women as at the core of that. So I think that that term intersectionality has been overused and popularized in a way that has completely sort of been diluted and lost from the core origination. And it is really important to me to call that into this room so that everyone here is aware of this. Of Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the foundation that she set for any of us to ever use that language of intersectionality goes back to her. So
I'm so grateful for that level setting that you just did there.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think in this conversation is between a brown woman and a Black woman, so we can understand the places where we have commonalities and the places that we have differences when we are talking about our life path through the creative industry and also through our own experiences through the patriarchy and the systems of racism in which we navigate every single day. Neither of us necessarily have the privilege to walk away from that, though there's a spectrum of those experiences that each of us have that are differing. Cool. So now we've talked about intersectionality briefly. Please look up Kimberly Crenshaw and read that. It's like a 30-page essay. It's incredible. I want to talk a little bit about defining insecurity, which is this month's Creative Mornings topic. Every individual may hear the word insecurity and think about it in a different way for their own life. I mean, it can be financial insecurity, it can be emotional insecurity, uncertainty, so many different things. For some, it can be an insurmountable obstacle, and for some, it actually may be something that is a motivator. And I've been thinking about that a lot since actually I was asked to sort of be a part of this talk many months ago, and how that's a key factor in my life, and how I'm sure it's a key factor in anyone's, and how it's something that I have come to know really well from a very young age, and fight it and also walk with it. I have like a thought, which is like, if you've ever walked across like a creek or a river, or even just walked across some uncertain sidewalk that's been broken up, and you walk across the stones and one is wobbly, or you don't know how secure the stone that you're walking on is going to be, you have to be ready to kind of shift your body quickly to adjust and get to the next strong stone. And I think that that's a really good metaphor for how I feel like I'm walking through life every single day. And you would think I'd have an actual like stronger core for it, but perhaps a stronger emotional core, certainly. Anyway, I think about that a lot in terms of navigating, the workspace, creative space, life in general. And I would love to just, ask you, Tahirah, like, when you think about the word insecurity, can you talk about like how it plays a role for you, as a creative or in your personal life, or of course, how all those things come together?
Absolutely. I'm going to very briefly, because you introduced yourself.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Tahirah Edwards-Byfield, a senior writer at 72 and Sunny down here in LA. I mean, if my accent doesn't give it away, I am not, in fact, from Arkansas. I'm from London originally. I used to live in Portland. It's where Nishat and I met, and now I'm down in LA. And so I also was thinking a lot about like what insecurity means as we started to prepare for this. And what I realized is that until I actually really interrogated it, I had like a really narrow scope of how I viewed insecurity through a personal lens. Because I always used to be like, oh, I'm pretty grounded in self. So I never really felt like I carried insecurity, like, or at least emotional insecurity on a root level, right? I'm a writer, so of course, like, we live in a world of, oh my God, like right in the middle of the work, oh my goodness, what are words? This is rubbish, this is total garbage. And then you get to a certain point where you're like, oh, okay, it's actually good. But even in that space, I think there was always this foundational deep down belief that like the good words will come. But then when I interrogated this even further, I realized that there's this inherited insecurity that absolutely comes from moving through the world in an identity that I've continually seen being treated as less than, right? So even if I'm not directly on the end of negative treatment, like seeing the way Black women have been oppressed systemically, like throughout the world, is pervasive, and it shows up with me in places. Like for me, when I enter a creative professional space and I'm the only one who looks like me, I'm acutely aware of like, wow, for better or worse, I'm carrying more than just me in this room right now, and the pressure that builds, that carries. So yeah. I think, yeah, that's like my key thought of it.
Do you find that to be, yeah, I relate to that 100%. I think, at least in terms of being a brown woman, I think it's like, there are many rooms in which I am the only one. And there are moments in which I may see something that others aren't seeing because of that nature. And I've noticed that I take that insecurity and really sort of flip that into a motivation. There's a little bit of, there sometimes is a fear of, is no one else seeing this? Am I crazy? Like, what if I say something and no one else sort of understands it? I think in this time, certainly people are more open to like listening to that voice, especially exactly right now. But I think in the past couple of years, I've noticed that there is a little more sort of lubrication and comfort around like, oh, we can listen to somebody who's coming from a different perspective. But the challenge of like, something that I experience a lot is how to mitigate that, how to mitigate the translation of the feeling or the thing that I'm seeing to make it effective to the audience to whom I must translate that. I know, yeah. Perhaps I'm being a little vague.
No, usually it's like a process of making it palatable. Like, it's, in my experience, right? It's like, okay, if I'm telling you that you don't understand why making a blanket statement about, a blanket often inaccurate statement about the Black community, for example, is absolutely wrong, I need to filter it through a lens that, first of all, sort of takes the edge out of my tone. But secondly, like, if I can't appeal to like a root base of empathy, then I have to go, okay, what is the most logical way for me to get to that argument? I wonder if that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because, so I'm a first generation American. My parents immigrated from India. And I think that there is perhaps some commonality in the immigrant experience where you have to learn to, maybe don't have to, but there's a feeling that one must assimilate to the majority in order to be able to communicate, to thrive, and to sort of have one's own hold and survive, really. So, and I think that this is actually quite a part of that, is learning the psychology of how to communicate to the majority, which, as you're saying, is like, sometimes you have to think about how do you filter your own voice so that it will be most effective, which is actually like really labor intensive and quite tragic yes, and it's really sad to think like if either of us experience something that is painful to us at our core, to say, no, this is actually painful to our communities, this is hurtful to Black and brown This message is not actually effective. This is purely aesthetic or tokenizing or any of these things that we see in the work or in this particular moment. The time and emotion that it takes to mitigate and translate the language to make it palatable to then create action for our predominantly like white spaces at work and even in life is one, I think natural, like ironically natural for the immigrant experience because that's about survival. And two, has become, I think, I'm not an immigrant, but I've inherited those qualities from my parents because I've seen them, code switch and context switch very quickly to be able to what I call like thrive and survive. And maybe it's survive and thrive because the survival comes first.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting because before I even had the language or learning to process this, I very quickly understood that as a Black girl, I had to be motivated by being the underdog, right? And like people would say, would tell me I'm really well spoken, but left a bit unsaid and hanging in the air, like, for a Black girl or for a girl from Peckham, which is the neighborhood in South London that I grew up in, which is now a very trendy, gentrified area. You guys totally understand this with North Portland and other areas, but it definitely had a bad rep back in the day. And so I'm going to give a very brief history lesson, British history lesson to ground this for everyone. I'm of Jamaican heritage, and I actually come from a line of incredibly creative women, men and women, but when I look at like my grandmothers on my father and mother's side, both were creators. My dad's mom was a dressmaker, and she could bake like a boss. My mom's mom could write beautifully and was this incredible storyteller. And it was interesting because I think on my dad's side of the family, they were the first lot to try, my dad and his siblings, to try and like make money out of creativity. And they definitely were treated like, what in the world are you doing? Because, Jamaicans and Caribbean people have this really interesting foundation in the UK that in many ways mirrors the African American experience here. So even though the UK ended slavery a little bit before the US, and Brits will tell you that often very proudly, the Caribbean was still considered like a British colony until the 60s. So to really contextualize that means like, Jamaica didn't get their independence till 1962. So the island where the enslaved people lived and had to work the land was still deemed property of the slavers 50 years ago. So once you think about it like that, it's like, okay. So when World War II ended in like 1945 and England was a mess, they invited their colonies over to basically clean up the streets under the pretense that the streets were paved with gold. So that generation is called the Windrush generation. Everybody definitely look it up afterwards. I think it will be really interesting for you to even see how it's a fascinating insight on both British history and how systemic racism at a governmental level was impacting that community now too. But, you had these people come over and do essential work. And, they were the postmen and women, they worked in the hospital, they drove the buses. And you had a lot of highly educated Caribbean people take clerical jobs. And so essentially they were like the first generation of like POC in the UK en masse, even though there were like Black and brown people in the UK before that. So the first to really deal with that systemic and institutional racism, DESI, so South Asian communities and African communities started migrating just a smidge later. And of course, India had the same like similarly horrific British colonization story.
2 years later, you're talking about 1945, the Windrush.
Yeah.
India gained its independence from the British in 1947. That's
exactly. And so when you think about everyone, it was kind of in like maybe the 50s that like Indian communities started coming to the UK. But so when you think about all of that, like you still have this thing of like that first brush of institutional racism had like Black people, not thriving in schools, not like coming into broken systems, like, and like basically very much being pushed to survive. So creative endeavors, there's still a little bit of that respectability politics at play, where it's like, okay, now we're being, if we are in an opportunity to be considered as almost equal as our white counterparts, go to university and become a doctor or a lawyer, or like, you know, don't do something no one can understand. Yeah, we like to make good music to dance to or whatever, but like that can't be all you're about. And you know, a lot of families are definitely on that. Yeah.
Oh, yes, you know, I think like there's so many intersecting layers literally just within that. When you're talking about Windrush, I was thinking about this book called Freedom at Midnight, which literally starts out describing sort of like war-torn Europe and everything that had been going on at the end of World War II, which I think, again, like so much of that is educated in, I mean, at least in the American school system, but what isn't educated is like not even detangling, but the sort of like dropping of the colonies that happened after that. And that is like such an interesting piece of history. Freedom at Midnight is a book that starts painting that portrait and then sort of switches over to India and talks about the relieving of the British from India after 300 years of being there. But that is awesome, and I love that history, and I think it's really important level setting, so thank you. And one of the things that you started to get into is like this value of a creative as a POC, and I'm just going to use POC here. I think it is important for like those in the audience, especially in Portland, to understand that POC is not a blanket term. There's a difference between Black and Indigenous folks and what their experience is versus a non-Black POC like myself. There's like a whole spectrum of privilege, and it's really important just to say that. But anyway, when we're talking about the value of creative as a POC, one of the things for myself is like, I always was a kid that was like really into art, and I found that, you know, insecurity for me landed in this search to find myself or to actually see myself in places that I didn't. Or to be able to tell my story, not even from an individual level, which I think was maybe the initial motivation, to be able to be like, I made this thing, this is my point of view. But the power of a people of color's point of view is actually so exponentially strong in a world where there's so much lack of representation for us. Where when you're walking around and you don't see mirrors of yourself reflected, and while you talk about your family being full of, you know, like creative women, and of course, like in music, as I know as your dad too, but I think that working as a designer for me, or as an artist for me, is a way to be able to help control and contribute to the narrative for beauty, for storytelling, for not just for myself to see myself, but for others too as well. And I think that that's something that in design and advertising we often forget, because we are client serving, we're not self-serving necessarily.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so like being an artist is this mechanism to represent ourselves and to amplify our own stories, and then being a designer or being a writer is, you know, this sort of tool to help clients understand themselves and or optimize the story that they need to tell in order to reach an audience. And only in the last, I don't know, I mean, I've been in this industry for a long time, you know, over 15 years. Only until very recently, I think, are we even talking about the importance of reaching a diverse community through advertising.
Yeah, totally. Like 100% the same. For me, like writing and storytelling, design has always been like my conduit for feeling whole when I felt a little less than, and definitely other people's work, you know, more than mine. And I got to the point where, you know, me and my friends a few years back started a print magazine called, I say Plantain, but you know, the masses say Plantain Papers.
Papers.
You know, just to focus on our storytelling, like to tell the stories of these communities that often get lost because I felt it missing in my work. That was definitely one of the big motivations. But then I think there was an active pivot point for me where I'm like, okay, yes, it's good to have something that I have creative control on over, and I can like make it for my community and involve them. But like the buying power of Black and brown people just means that we should be represented in the work, you know? So that's definitely when I pivoted my eye, and rather than going, okay, cool, I'm just going to see it as a lost cause, I was like, this is the point I have to fight for.
Yes, totally. And, you know, I think like there's a lot of talk right now in our creative industry about representation in, you know, jobs and seats, which is so important. Oh my God, so important. And I think that, you know, that is extremely important, period. Hire Black creatives, give them a microphone, give them appropriate and extra pay for the extra labor that they are doing. That is absolutely essential. And also create an environment in which they can actually do the work, and also consider the work itself. I think that there's so many things of like, oh, okay, right now in this moment in particular, there's this really interesting, I don't know if I call it a paradigm shift, where, you know, we have held this, you know, these complexities of our identities and navigated through sort of mitigating translation in these spaces practically our whole lives. And now there's this moment where I'm seeing maybe not the weight coming off of our shoulders, but a communal weight being bared by white folks and the industry at large of realizing, oh, we are caught with our pants down right now. Maybe there's not a single Black creative in the office. How many Black leaders are there, or brown? How many people within that are actually speaking up? Because I think there's an important point to make, which is not every person from an ethnic minority group is a monolith and can speak for the entirety.
Yes, exactly. And that's our issue with, that's what happens when tokenism happens, when there's only one who's been given the weight to represent our whole community. But sorry, please continue.
Yes, and we have to start somewhere. We have to start with like representation and creating sort of amassing a certain level of representation where Black and brown individuals can be themselves. And you know, anyway, there's so many things I can say on this point, but when I think about like you creating Plantain Papers as this avenue to amplify your voice and your story, and not having necessarily like looking for a home for that place, did you have like points of inspiration prior to, like, is there other work out there that was really inspiring you to make that?
Oh my goodness. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to drop a set of links in the chat afterwards, because I feel like there's so many sources of inspiration that I had. Much of it though wasn't from, because when we started it, we wanted it to be centered on like communities of the wider African diaspora, and like Asian diasporas as well, because there are many people who use this fruit, so we use it as a conduit to have this conversation, right? Like, but because my friends who I started it with are both of British, like we're both we're all Black British women, we were like, okay, it's only now we're starting to see essays, we're starting to see work like Good Immigrant by Nishat Akhtar, and like we're starting to see the work where all these different voices are pouring in, but it took a long time. You know, I think I had to look to fiction, I had to look to like Zadie Smith to see a lot of the work. But yeah, so I think one thing I want to sort of pivot back on though, one thing that's really interesting about this paradigm shift in this moment is it feels a lot bigger because and I definitely agree, it feels like the weight is being shared substantially, because we're now not just talking about like us having to justify why we should be in the room. everyone sort of understanding like white supremacy, you know, in general, right? And like, and can I just say, like, real quick, white supremacist systems are at their core based on insecurity and capitalism, but that's a digression we don't have time for. And so I think, you know, when you see, you're like, oh, systemic racism was literally invented to uphold this false ideology that some people have to be oppressed for other people to succeed. There's this like a much larger unpacking happening, right? And so you've got this like global uprising around race, and it means that people are just examining a lot of things now in a totally different way. And you know, to be transparent too, that work is being done off the basis of Black trauma, you know, like from seeing Black people being executed by the police to like finally understanding microaggressions that affect Black and brown people and other POC people, you know. But I think, so the reason why, like, even thinking about how we push our brands and the work we do in this space, it feels like you can't, there's no time for virtue signaling. You have to be really like, brands are getting called the fuck out. Yeah. Like they're getting called out now if they try and perform. And the fact is, one thing that I find I'm doing in my work and my colleagues are actively doing in our work is trying to lead our brands not to pretend that they're not complicit. Everybody's got a level of complicity. You know, I think it's much easier for everyone to be like, okay, cool, we know we have work to do, and here's how we actively do make some form of change. You know, I look at like what Nickelodeon is doing with the kids and literally putting like, they put an 8-minute, 46-second of silence on the screen a few weeks ago. They put a commercial on, they're running like bits that's like, okay, the work hasn't stopped now. I think of Glossier, which is like a direct to consumer beauty brand that's huge now. And like, I don't know whether it was their ad consultants or whether it was something they decided internally, which honestly means that it's actually good work because you can't tell what side it came from. They haven't put out some like statement, you know, on a black box. They were like, cool, we're gonna donate $1 million or $500,000 to Black beauty brands, and we're gonna donate another $500,000 to actually like action works that are happening on the ground, basically. So yeah, it just feels like we have to push everyone to do the actual work now, and like it's a fuzzy area, but that feels like the space that we're in.
Hell yeah. I mean, it's like, don't talk about it, be about it, right? Like
exactly.
There's, or talk about it and be about it.
Be about it. That.
Talk about it and be about it. And like, you know, I was thinking about this idea of representation of the maker, where, you know, with Plantain Papers, how, you know, the three of y'all came together and put together this incredible book that's come out three times? Or
twice. There was gonna be one this year, but COVID happened. So we're about to release a digital one, which is all contributor led. We just like gave people the little money we could and was like, just submit. But sorry.
No, it's cool. I think like when you're talking about like Good Immigrant as an example of like storytelling that is felt like nourishment in a way to hear a variety of stories of first generation and immigrant folks, which was, that book came out like 3-4 years ago, and we were all reading it at the same time. Highly recommend it to everyone in this audience. The thing about amplifying the voices of Black, brown, queer, trans folks is like right now we're in this wave of many people experiencing those voices for the first time, which of course is not necessarily the case. Like just to go all the way back to the beginning of this, like Kimberly Crenshaw wrote that her essay of intersectionality in 1989, but the dilution and diminishing of these terms and people and stories happens when we don't respect the architect of what's out there. It's when inspiration becomes appropriation, and then we lose the cultural context of something that was originally set up to help bolster these voices. So I think that the differentiation right now of anyone being inspired by anyone is available because of the internet, or really has always been available. But drawing a line between what a person is appropriating and actually honoring is two separate things. And, you know, like with representation of the maker, it's like, well, shoot, Emory Douglas was doing this for the Black Panther Party in the 60s, you know? And I mean, and even today you have like incredible artists like Kehinde Wiley out there just like making unbelievable works of art that fill like 30 galleries in a museum and everything in between. There are, you know, indie comic book illustrators, there are, you know, writers, and there are designers of all levels that somehow many eyes have either not sought out or have not been amplified or have not been paid for. So I think that there's like all of that work that has to be done, aside from just like, oh my God, we need to hire someone, or oh my God, we need to put somebody in a photo, or oh my God, we need to like, you know, throw money to a GoFundMe. It's like, well, actually taking the second to understand the context and history of an individual, of the music you listen to, of the art you like, of all of those things, which completely, I think, has been diluted in this like world of appropriation in design and in writing, without actually slowing down to be like, oh no, I'm actually inspired by this author because I am inspired by this music because I heard this term that was coined by this person and it came from this struggle because.
Right. So how much of your work as a creative director is that? Like how much is that of you going, here's why we need to bring an Asian POV to this table, or here's why, you know, we actually need like a Black writer on this thing. Yeah, how does that? I
think that intentionality is so important. And on my team at work, we are like hyper intentional about that specifically. So if we have something that is, you know, honoring, for example, like the Black Lives Matter movement on a client project, which we did have recently, where we were pitching some ideas around the 4th of July. And it was like, oh, that feels really icky right now to be doing anything that's pointing towards something that's red, white, and blue. How do we, you know, do some appropriate storytelling that is context setting for actually not only what's going on right now, because what's going on right now has history all the way back to the 4th of July and before. We make sure to have appropriate people vetting that work. So by that, it means if we don't have Black folks on that team, we make sure that we have someone internally that is evaluating that, because literally how can you tell a story if you actually don't understand? I can empathize, and like I have, you know, certain experiences of my own with, you know, racism in my daily life and everything, but I still cannot, I can mentally put myself in those shoes, but I physically can't put myself in that skin. So for us in our work, we have made it essential and a priority to make sure that it's going through the appropriate filters. So it's not like a whoops, who decided that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I think anyone who is working agency side or even like brand side and marketing spaces, just make it a practice to, if your team lacks that representation, you need to put together a consultation task force. It's so essential. And I think as well, like the thing that I hope everyone's starting to understand is it's not about like box checking as well. Like if you're telling a story and it doesn't have an Asian voice in it, you are missing a fundamental part of the picture often, like where it's appropriate, you know, like, and it doesn't have a Black voice, you're missing a fundamental part of the picture. So yeah.
Also, we're just rad and beautiful and have like, come on now. Like,
so much to bring, it's so much to give.
Completely. And all of the context switching and translations that we've done is like all of the languages that we understand that frankly white folks have never had to even consider is like, while it's not a negative for us, it's a plus for us, and it's a plus for every, you know, agency and community that can bring us into it.
Totally. So no, you go.
Well, dang, Tahirah, I feel like we could really just talk about all this stuff forever.
Right.
And I was looking at the time, and it's 9:40, and I know we're meant to like sort of shift to some Q&A, but I was wondering if you had anything before we sort of get into that you wanted to sort of to just say in this moment?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I am part of a LA-based team of Black creatives called Three's a Crowd. And on Juneteenth, which was last Friday, hopefully some of you guys got to take that time to reflect, we launched an initiative inviting the advertising industry to increase their Black leadership to 13% by 2023. So for context, we're kind of averaging at around 2% Black leadership right now, which, you know, is trash. So 2 to 13 is not an easy curve, but it's advertising. You know, we don't do shit without a sharp brief and a grueling deadline. Like, we don't have to do anything.
But
like,
so much can be done in that time. That's the thing.
Exactly. So what we're doing is not just like inviting companies to say that they're going to get there. We're working with them and giving them tools. So the initiative is called In for 13. The website is pledgeinfor13.com. I'll drop it into the chat. And like, really, it's just, you know, for context also as well, 13% is what, you know, the estimate of the population is, the Black population is in the United States.
Really?
So, yeah, ish. You know, I feel like the census is a little fucked, but, you know. And I think in tandem, we should be talking about, like, obviously, again, sharp brief, very necessary in advertising. We're focusing on increasing the number of Black creatives. But again, when I talk about us needing to have the full picture, it's like, you also need to have Latinx representation in your leadership. Like, those need to be the decision makers. Yes. You need to have Asian representation. You need to have queer, non-binary people in the room. Like, these are very important things. Like, you need to have people who are differently able. And like, they need to have positions of autonomy. Like, we're so used to seeing, you know, like entry-level programs, which are really important. But what happens is, as we've seen, as we've sort of like looked at trying to get more women to stay in the industry, there's often a drop-off point because their glass ceiling comes down.
Yes.
So, you know, I think when we think about like less tokenism and more balanced voices, and not just like that one Black person, you know, to talk about like every person who's not white, like, you know, even beyond that, it's like, you put that leadership at the top, you're gonna have a more diverse segment all the way through the business.
Yes,
because you got 13%. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Because hopefully, I mean, I think that the hope is, or at least the pattern is, people in leadership traditionally, when there have been like exclusively white folks in those rooms, see people that are younger than them, that look like them, that remind them of themselves, and then they want to help those people.
Exactly.
You know, I never had a mentor in this industry. You know, there was never anyone that was like, oh, I really want to like help you out. That wasn't the thing. And I think when I came into leadership, for me, it was like, how can I be the voice of the voiceless? How can I help those that haven't had those opportunities? And also those that I identify with may not be those that the sort of homogenous group have identified with the whole time. So being able to spread that wealth and spread that love is so, so important.
Totally. I think I know we've got to wrap up soon, but one thing you touched on that's really important is how sometimes exclusionary the idea of like corporate culture can be. So I think even just by having more representation all the way through the business, it widens the aperture for all that stuff. So before we jump over to Q&A questions, I really want to know from you, what is the way, so guys, I'm really passionate about self-care, and I want you guys to think about this also, but what are the ways you're looking after yourself in this time, Nishat? Like we're going through a pandemic and a racial uprising, you know, and we still got to keep ourselves alive. So what are you doing?
You know, T, that's a really, thank you for calling that out as a priority. I said it to Fran earlier, where Fran says she wasn't sleeping, and Fran is doing this work to support our community, and is it like a perfect example of someone who's just like putting their body out there and not necessarily sleeping. And I think that there's a pattern for those of us that are, you know, being active within our brown and Black and queer communities, to do the work tirelessly and not take a break. I never saw my mom take a break in her life. And I am trying to learn how to do that. one of the things that's been really, in the old world, I used to play soccer every week, and that was really cathartic with an amazing group of women. And now one of the things that I do is I try to just listen to records. I'll put on a record, and I don't have a coffee table in my living room. I lay on the floors. My phone is not near me, and I just like spend the time absorbing music. So it is like, the gift of time is not one that I have very much, especially right now, ironically working so much. And also like at work and with everything going on and connecting with friends and making sure everybody's doing all right. But listening to music and trying to create space and time, and music is one of the only art forms that demands your time. And it's sort of a reciprocal gift in that way. So I'm trying to create time for that.
I love that. It sounds like you're just stealing a moment for yourself, at least.